This meeting is being recorded.
Gruit Herbs, an introduction to hopless brewing, taught by al-Sayyida, Naila, al-Zarqa.
Thanks for the introduction. Hello, I'm Naila, al-Zarqa, and I'll be teaching you today. Feel free to jump in if you've got questions or post them in chat. I'll try and keep an eye on that as well. But yeah, let's get started. So I don't know how many people here are brewers or just people interested in Gruit Herbs. I will say that this class is mostly focused on the more practical perspective of brewing, the modern brewing in a modern, medieval recreation sense with the Gruit Herbs. And it's a little less focused on the actual history of them. That would be an entire class all in and of itself. And one I am not yet qualified to teach, although I have been researching them. If I click on the thing, it moves. Maybe. Sorry, I'm trying to get the slides to advance. There we go. Okay. So before we can talk really about, Gruit Herbs and Gruit beer, we need to talk about what beer actually is. So per the Merriam-Webster definition, it's pretty much any kind of alcoholic beverage made with some kind of malted cereal grain. Barley is pretty common, especially in, the European areas. Flavored with hops and brewed by slow fermentation. This method of brewing dates back a very, very long time to at least the 5th millennium BC. Although in those days, they tended to throw just about anything fermentable in the pot together. So you'd get fruits and honey in there too. Some other kind of relevant things is the Reinheitsgebot of 1516 codified the allowable ingredients of beer in Bavaria, specifically to be water, malt, hops. Yeast was not included in the list until later because it wasn't necessarily known to be a separate ingredient. It kind of got in wildly, and they knew that they needed something from the previous batch to kind of kick it along, but they didn't understand exactly what that was. But it's noteworthy that, that distinctly prohibits the use of gruit, which was fairly common in Europe prior to that. And then in England, in around the same time period, a distinction was made between beer, which was hopped, and ale, which was not hopped. Modernly, the distinction is more commonly between ale, which is top fermented, and lager, which is bottom fermented. So to avoid confusion, I will be using beer most of the time. I may throw in the word ale. I mean the same thing. I'm not making a distinction. Everything I'm going to be talking about is non-hopped. So call it whatever you like. I do the same. We're going to, again, not much of the history of Gruit. It was used for a very long time, but hops did eventually take over. The earliest records of hop cultivation that we have are from Germany, and they date back to about the 9th century. It was referenced in Hildegard von Bitten's Physica Sacra as useful for inhibiting spoilage in beverages, but otherwise not much use for a person. But that is, a large part of the reason why hops are used for beer is it takes a lot longer to spoil when there's hops in it. And then in mainland Europe, hops gained popularity in the 13th and 14th centuries for a variety of reasons, socio-political largely. Again, not going to go into that. It'd be a whole other class in and of itself. And then in England, they held out a little longer, resisted using hops, but by the time the 15th century rolled around, they were in pretty common use and have been ever since. But lately, there's been a resurgence of people interested in, the use of Gruit Herbs in beer for a variety of reasons, partially because there's a lot of people, including me, who don't like the taste of hops, but do enjoy beer if it's, brewed without hops. So the sort of general format is I'm going to be going through the different common or relatively common Gruit Herbs, talking about some of their noteworthy properties, their taste notes, and then, usage recommendations and any cautions that there may be, because some of these herbs do have cautions, and we'll go through those. So it is worth noting that hops is technically a Gruit herb. So if you're doing a Gruit beer, you can use hops. It just won't be the dominant flavor necessarily. It will be in balance with the others. So its properties that are, of particular use to us brewers, it's antibacterial, antimicrobial, antimicrobial, and a preservative. Depending on the specific variety, you can get just about any taste you want. Mostly bitter if you're using them in a bittering fashion, which means you add them earlier in the boil, and more flavorful if you add them later in the boil. And then there's a ton of information out there for, trying to figure out what style you want. If you're trying to mimic a particular style, what hops you would need, the different flavors of the different varieties. So that information is not that hard to find. So I'm not, listing any particular resources. And then the caution for hops is it can actually make depression worse. So random fun fact of the day. There will be many more. All right. So we'll start out talking about the more common Gruit herbs based on, there are historical records. I don't really reference them here. I haven't read most of them, but it's mostly, registers. The saying is that the two things you can always count on are death and taxes. Well, Gruit was taxed, so they kept records, at least in some areas. So in those areas, Sweet Gale and Marsh Rosemary were the two very common ones. Yarrow was also fairly common in other areas, and Horehound as well is a great bitterant. So Sweet Gale, also known as bog myrtle, it's the noteworthy properties. It's got antiseptic properties, which are helpful, but not necessarily antimicrobial. So it doesn't act as good of a preservative in beer as hops would. It's also intoxicating in and of itself. So it adds to that effect of the beer. And it's got, to some extent, it's got a flavor that's not dissimilar to a lot of hops. It's got something of a resinous flavor that's common. I've heard it described as like a spicy eucalyptus, which you can kind of picture if you've ever smelled eucalyptus. And then if you steep it long enough, it does develop a bit of a bitterness. And then depending on if you're trying for a more sweet or a more herbal flavor, you'd use the flowers versus the leaves. And I'll note that some of these taste notes are my own personal experience and the experience of other people who've tasted these things with me, which is why a little bit later on, you'll get contradictory information. Different people pick up different taste notes with these things. And then some of it comes from books. I've got references at the end. They're modern brewers who are working with Gruit herbs. And then usage recommendations, it actually works better as like a dry hop equivalent because the resins resolve more readily in alcohol. And you don't need a whole lot of it, 1/2 ounce per gallon roughly. And you usually use it with other ones. And the caution for this one is actually a fairly common caution, as we'll note. It's a known abortifacient. So anyone who's pregnant or thinks they might be pregnant or trying to become pregnant should not drink any beer that has this herb in it. The quantities that we're using are very low, so it shouldn't be a problem, but just to be on the safe side, that's the caution and recommendation for anyone who wants to brew with this one. There are other Gruit herbs that don't have that, so if you're worried about it, I would suggest working with the other Gruit herbs. Also, if I'm going too fast, let me know. I talk faster when I'm nervous. So the next one we're going to talk about is Marsh Rosemary. It goes by a couple names, wild rosemary. Also Labrador tea, it's commonly called, even though technically it's a different subspecies. And then Labrador tea, which I think is native to North America, is a bit less potent, but otherwise similar in taste and effect. So it might be worth using that one instead. One of the noteworthy properties here is that it does have narcotic properties. So again, adding to the effects of the beer, it's going to be different than a normal hopped beer would be. It does have antimicrobial properties, so it will help prevent spoilage in the beer to some extent. The taste of this one's a little bit odd. It's got this spicy, sort of sourish taste, but it's also kind of sweet. So it's kind of a weird balance. You have to play with it a little bit. Flowering tips have ledum oil in it. So use kind of sparingly. And then you'll use less of this, only 1/4 ounce per gallon. The caution here is don't heat the leaves up in a closed container. That is related to the ledum oil thing. And drinking too much beer with this can cause dizziness and headaches. So if you're drinking beer that has this in it and you start to get dizzy or have a headache, stop drinking it. Drink some water, eat some food, chill out for a little bit. Let's see. Yarrow is one of my personal favorites to play with. It's got a very mild taste to it, which is, it works really well. It also has antimicrobial and antibacterial properties, so it will help prevent spoilage. And like the other two, it adds to the effect of the beer. It is a narcotic and an inebriant all on its own. Taste-wise, as I mentioned, it's really pretty mild. I really like using this one. It's got a very light floral, herbally taste with a very mild bitter. But it is worth noting, I discovered this the hard way, the flavor can vary based on the location and the soil conditions where it was grown. So if you source Yarrow from multiple places or even from the same supplier, you know, at a time in the future, it may not taste the same. So you may have to adjust your quantities. So taste the herbs before you use them. I recommend brewing them up into a tea. That'll help you also with figuring out the timings. I think I've got some recommendations later on. That's one of them. And you use, again, not a whole lot of this, 1/4 to less than 1/2 ounce per gallon. And the white flowered variety is the best for brewing. And then this one's got an allergic cross-reactivity warning on it. And don't use a lot of it if, again, you're pregnant or think you might be pregnant. So those were the most common ones based on the limited historical literature that we have. Some of the other ones that were in use we'll talk about is, you know, this list. Any questions so far? Yeah, I see a hand up.
Would you generally use a mixture of these, or just so you've had experiments and you know which mixture quantities of all these you like the taste of?
Yes. So mostly, again, I've got some recommendations closer to the end on like how to use Gruit Herbs, but largely I will look up the flavor profile of the hops that go into a particular style if I'm trying to make a particular style. And then map those flavor notes from the hops to the Gruit Herbs and try and come up with a combination there. And then, but yeah, it's mostly just experimentation.
Okay, thank you.
There are a few that I'll do solo, like Lavender actually is a really good one just by itself. But for the most part, yeah, it's a blend of multiple ones. Good question. Okay, I'll talk about some of the rest of them. So the first one is one that I finally managed to source. It took me ages. So I'm excited to get to play with it. I haven't done much yet. But it's called ground ivy or Alehoof, which kind of lends, the name tells you that it was used for Gruit, the ale part. And an interesting property for it is that it has high tannins. And if you brew other things like wines especially, tannins are important for that. And I found that they're also can be very helpful in meads as well. So it might be interesting to try a mead with Gruit Herbs. It's on my list of things to try. And the part of the reason why this was so interesting to me and why I was trying to get my hands on it, it's very mildly bitter, but it's got this like, apparently this peppery balsamic fragrance to it. So I'm really fascinated to try playing with it. The other interesting thing is that it's apparently useful for clarifying beer, so making it clear, which is helpful. especially for the Gruit beers, you end up drinking them pretty young because they will sour as they age. Without the hops, super strong preservative qualities, they do eventually go sour. In the most part, they actually taste pretty decent if you like sour beer, but you do have to watch out for that. And then the quantities for that one, there's a much wider range. So that's really just one you gotta kind of got to play with. And then again, it is a known abortifacient, so be cautious using it. Horehound is another one of those ones I have sort of a love-hate relationship with. It is very bitter to me. One of my previous taste testers picked up a grassy flavor with no bitterness in it whatsoever. So if you're going to use Horehound, I recommend using a very small amount of it, and know that some people may like it more than others. Apparently, it is still used today for certain medicinal things in herbal medicine. And then again, really small amounts. Although there is I guess a Horehound beer that is made in, I think, Europe, that's got a pretty strong Horehound flavor and people like it. So who knows? The caution here is large doses can cause vomiting. So again, be careful. Try not to use a whole ton of it. And don't just like eat it. Meadowsweet is one of my other favorite ones to play with because again, it's got a very mild flavor to it. It also does have preservative effects to some extent. Again, nothing like hops, unfortunately. And it's got a very pleasant note. It's noted that it's often paired with heather, which we'll talk about when we get to the regional Gruit herbs. And you can use quite a lot of it to get the flavor you want. And again, it's got notes of possible allergies, and don't drink it if you think you might be pregnant. And I see things are going on in chat, but I can't actually see what's there. So if there's a question that pops up in chat, please, can someone come off mic and repeat it? So Mugwort is another one.
Mostly talking about Horehound candy.
Ah, yeah, I've heard of it. I don't think I've ever tried it. I'm not sure I want to after having tasted Horehound. But you know, maybe the sweetness balances out the bitter. So Mugwort is another one of those ones that the common name tells you that it was used for brewing. The mug and the wort are both related to brewing. And it's part of the same family as Wormwood, which is generally more commonly known, but it's a lot milder in effect. And it's partially for that reason easier to find. It is an antibacterial, so it can help to some extent prevent spoilage. It's got some aromatics. It's largely just kind of bitter, but again, it's a milder bitterness than Wormwood, so it works pretty well. And you don't need to use a lot of it. And again, it's a known abortifacient, so caution there.
Have you tried Wormwood? It's very interesting.
Yeah, I don't think I've been able to source Wormwood yet. I was able to source some seeds to grow it, but it didn't grow. So no,
if you PM me, I can send you some dried. I have a whole mess of it.
Oh, nice. Will do.
I use it for mead, and I also make like an absinthe pastis with it.
Oh, that'd be cool.
It is. It is. It's really very licorice tasting. Even the flowers, like you can just chew the flowers.
All right, so I won't like it. Good to know. I hate licorice. But it might be interesting to use it in a beer because sometimes the flavors change. We'll talk about that when we get to lavender, when you brew with it. So the note here is that it's actually better to source it from an herbal supply rather than a brewing supply. They go through their stock faster, so they'll have fresher things. That's kind of common to any of these really, but apparently Wormwood, from what I've read, is particularly notorious about that. It is mildly narcotic and apparently psychotropic, so it's gonna, increase the effect of your beer. So again, small quantities, for most of the Gruit ones, if you're drinking, it's not one you're going to want to drink lots and lots and lots of, because a lot of these herbs do have additional intoxicating effects. So please drink responsibly. This one also has antimicrobial properties, and the taste notes for this in beer are basically just it's bitter. So if you like bitter beer and don't want to deal with hops, Wormwood's one of the ones you can use for that. And then again, use smaller quantities of it, similar to Horehound. And then the cautions are, if you get a headache while drinking beer with Wormwood, stop. It's bad. If you keep drinking, you can have very bad health ramifications. And then, as I mentioned, it's considered toxic, so it's more difficult to source because of health regulations. Not impossible, just more difficult.
So how many people here would consider that to be a challenge rather than a warning? This is the SCA.
I know the guy who grows it, so I don't have any problems getting it.
Yeah, so in general, like if you know people who've got this, most of these are considered weeds and grow rampant. I currently live in a desert where nothing grows rampant, so I have to buy all my stuff.
We have mugwort locally in creek bottoms, dry creek bottoms and stuff. It grows there in creek beds, so we often get it wild.
Okay, yeah, the caution with foraging things is the general caution with foraging things. Make sure you know what it is you're foraging. There are plants that look like other plants, and some of those plants are nasty. So be very extra sure you know what you got.
Well said.
Thanks. All right. And then sage is one that, despite the fact that I grow culinary sage in my garden for culinary, I have never actually tried using it in beer yet. I haven't found a beer that I think would go well with it, but I do want to try it. So you can use both culinary sage and clary sage. They'll have slightly different taste notes. Again, they will increase the inebriating effects of the alcohol, so drink responsibly. And they're also antibacterial and antimicrobial, and they contain tannins. So, you know, you got a little bit of everything going on with the sage. They're both bitter, and then you get a balsam-like aroma with the clary sage, and apparently a camphor-like scent with the culinary sage. I've never actually tried camphor. It's on my list of things I need to try for culinary reasons. So I can't speak to how accurate that taste assessment is, but maybe someday. And again, flavors change when you actually expose them to alcohol in a few cases. So just because it doesn't taste like that when fresh out of the garden doesn't mean it won't if you brew with it. This is another one that works a little bit better dry hopping it, as much as you can use dry hop as a term with, you know, Gruit herbs, but putting it into secondary fermentation rather than into the boil, because the oils dissolve better in alcohol. And again, you're not going to need a whole lot of sage in any case, especially if it's dried. If it's fresh, you use a little bit more because the oils are less concentrated. Again, this should not be consumed while you're pregnant. And there's another kind of sage called Spanish sage that can have adverse effects. So again, make sure you know what it is you're using. And then sage can also affect blood sugar levels, which is another random fun fact for the day. So if that is a concern, be cautious with it. Lavender, another one of my favorite ones. Lavender is a totally weird, surprising herb. So when you use it in brewing, it ends up tasting absolutely nothing like it smells fresh. So like, I know a lot of people, like I hand them a beer that's a lavender beer and they're like, I'm like, just taste it. And they're like, wow, this is really good. Yeah, it does not taste anything like it smells once you brew with it. So that one's one of the ones where it's a little tricky to kind of plan out including it in the Gruit until you've actually brewed with it and tried it for yourself. So highly recommend. It makes a great pale ale. And then the notes here are English lavender has a milder taste than the other species of lavender. So depending on what you're going for, that's either a good thing or a bad thing. The taste notes are really, it's got a complex bitterness, and that's honestly the best way I can describe it even. interesting and unique and doesn't taste like it smells. You use a fairly large amount of it for Gruit near the end of the boil, and then you can also dry hop it with the flowers. And then again, a caution: some varieties of lavender are mildly toxic, so don't use those. All right, give me a sec. Any questions before we move on to some of the regional ones?
Yeah, I was a little bit startled by the large numbers of these herbs that seem to be listed as possible abortifacients. And I'm just wondering, is that a general characteristic of herbs, or is it just that the ones that happen to be good for brewing also happen to be bad for fetuses? I just noticed that almost all of them.
I guess it means you can tank up your girl on this kind of beer and she won't get her pregnant.
I was not going to go there, Selene. No, I was not going to go there.
My guess was that like some of these, anti-everything properties that is good for somewhat preventing spoilage in beer is also good for like messing with the chemistry in your body, which can be a good thing and can be a bad thing,
Yes.
depending.
Hi, biologist.
List.
Hi, biologist. Things that are preservative, right? Things that are strong enough to kill all of the microbes in something and keep it so that no microbes can grow in it. Also not so good for your dividing cells.
That makes sense.
The hops are probably also bad.
Like it gets very complicated, but like in a very general, like very big general, like
I think if you washed with it, they would be different,
Right, but
yeah, and again, the quantities you're going to be using in the Gruit are nowhere close, truly, honestly, to what you would need to cause problems, but have to put the caution out there just in case. Like it has been known to in the past have these properties. Okay, we'll talk about the regional ones. These ones are got some very interesting flavors to them. They're fun to play with. So Broom, I haven't actually gotten a chance to play with yet. Yes, and somebody put in the chat, alcohol itself is not exactly great to be drinking while you're pregnant. So I mean, really, just don't. But these would potentially make it even worse than that. So Broom is another one I'm trying to grow some because I can't find any like dried. So if anyone's got a source for that, hit me up. But interestingly enough, it's intoxicating on its own in sufficient quantities. There's a hand up. Do you have a question? Do not grow Broom.
yes.
Okay.
Hi. Biologist. Sorry. 1 second. I will start video. You'll get to see me super random sitting in my house. Hello. Biologist, Pacific Northwest. Please do not grow Broom. Broom is one of the most invasive plants in the Pacific Northwest and has taken over literally whole states. If you would like Broom, I will send you a carload of Broom, but I would also highly recommend you not ingest Broom. Broom is way more toxic than a lot of the things that people are generally using as a Gruit agent.
Good to know.
Broom,
Yeah,
you should dye things yellow with it.
Okay.
I will send you pictures of an entire mountain covered in Broom, and they literally hire government contractors to try and fail to get rid of Broom here. Don't go Broom.
Okay. Yeah, they were selling it at my local hardware store. Also, I'm in the middle of the desert, so like I figure that's the least in play. Like if anything's going to be invasive, it's probably not going to be able to invade in a desert. But yeah, no, that's a good point. Most of these herbs are considered weeds, and some of them are apparently considered invasive. So the taste notes for this one are that it's bitter and astringent. Again, I haven't gotten a chance to play with it, so I don't know for sure if there's anything more to that. And then you use the flowering tops, and you use a decent quantity of them, although maybe that's not such a great idea. And then the cautions here are ingesting of too much can result in vomiting and lower blood pressure, so be careful with it. And Spanish broom specifically is not good. It's mildly poisonous. Please don't use. Except for possibly for dyeing of, things, pretty colors. Heather is one that I have gotten to play with. I like heather in certain styles of beer. It's really good. You've got multiple varieties. Ling heather and bell heather are pretty commonly used for brewing. It's known, from a historical note, it's known to have been used by the Picts since at least approximately 2000 BC. So it's been around for a long time. And it's common in Scotland and other areas of Britain, but nowhere else really. So that's why it's one of the regional ones. It is a sedative, weirdly enough. And then it's got a lightly floral taste, a little bit of bitterness, and the bitterness is kind of a little bit complex. And apparently certain varieties are delicate and more buttery or honey-like. So, it's a fun one to play with. And of all of them, I think this is the only one I can say it has no known hazards. So, have fun, play with this one. It's as safe as you're going to get with the Gruit Herbs. And apparently it's particularly good in honey beers. So, Oh, and it blooms in winter. That's exciting. I should try growing some. I don't know if it'd like the desert. So Juniper is used primarily in the Scandinavian countries. Today, even it's still used in sati, which is a traditional Finnish beer. Although it's more used for like the flavor is infused via like filtering the wort through juniper branches, which I think is pretty cool. One of these days I'd love to try it. The other cool noteworthy property here is that juniper berries contain dextrose, which is a fermentable sugar. So you can get extra fermentable sugars by using juniper. It has it's noted to have a refreshing taste when used in beer, although, I mean, it's juniper, it's going to have a bit of a piney taste. So that can be a little unexpected if you just hand somebody a beer, they're not expecting it. And then, of course, it can be difficult to source the branches, so you can use the berries instead. But again, recognize that they have sugar in them that will ferment, so you're going to boost your alcohol content with those. And then the cautions here are don't drink it if you're pregnant or might be pregnant, and if you have kidney disease, also don't drink it. Don't ask me why. Our resident biologist might know, but I don't. Rue is another interesting one to play with. It's used in the 10th century Baghdadi cookbook. They have recipes for a honey beer that's not fermented for very long, so it's really more like a soda. But rue is in there as a bitterant. I've made the recipes a few times. You don't pick up a whole lot of the rue taste, but it does add sort of an extra dimension, which is kind of cool. It is highly bitter. And the caution here is that the oil can cause skin irritation. So wash your hands very thoroughly after you touch it. And again, it is a known abortifacient, as with a lot of these. So some of the modern beer styles that use Gruit, if you want to try some Gruit beer before you dive into making it yourself. Most of these also use hops to some extent, but the hops tend to be in balance with the other Gruit herbs. As it would have potentially been in period. The wit beer, saisons are commonly used that. Berliner Weiss, and some of the holiday ales will use different spices similar to the way you would use Gruit. Unfortunately, there doesn't seem to be a lot of commercial Gruit available. There are a few. They're very regional though. So if you get your hands on one, awesome. Otherwise, you're going to have to, brew some yourself or get another brewer to make you some. All right. Is my advice one next? Yeah. All right. So as I promised, I do have sort of a short practical guide to using the Gruit herbs. So So you can use them by themselves, except for like the heather, the juniper, the lavender, some of the regional stuff, and lavender. You would usually use them in combination with other herbs or with hops. And this is, I should mention, this is not an exhaustive list of Gruit herbs. These are just some of the more common ones that I was able to find information on. And then these herbs are usually added to the boil. And I call it that because that's usually what you call that stage of the brewing process. But with Gruit herbs, you don't actually have to boil the wort. The reason you do for hops is to extract the resins. That's not the case here. And based on my own experimentation, it actually works a lot better if you don't boil it. I found out the hard way because my stove does not do low like at all. And the one I had previous did do like barely like couldn't boil stuff, and now I can't not boil stuff. So it's been weird trying to adjust the ratios to account for the fact that like I can't not boil the stuff if I want to heat it for any amount of time. I'm still playing around with it. And then the primary challenge for anyone who wants to brew with Gruit is figuring out the amount of each herb and the timing. Again, with hopped beers, there's been so much experimentation and people recording it over the last century or however long that it's pretty well known if you want to make a certain style how to do that with hops. But with Gruit, there's been a few people who have been, trying to research it over the past decades and, record it, write it down and share the information, but it's still pretty sparse. It's getting better, but it's still a lot of experimentation. So one method that you can kind of give you something of an idea for the taste is to brew a tea with the herb and taste it at different intervals. That'll give you an idea for, how the flavor changes over time based on the amount of time on the heat and then at what point it turns bitter. The downside for this one is that it doesn't really tell you how the flavor is going to change in the alcohol. So like lavender, it does nothing for you to tell you what the final flavor is going to be. And some of the others will also change a little bit. Lavender is really the big one though. And then some of the references in the bibliography that I have contain recipes. So usually those are a good starter point. Brew those up, see how you like them, and then adjust accordingly from there. But at least it gives you a starting point. And then I don't think I put it in here, but if you're using a combination of different herbs, you don't use the full quantity of each herb. You basically, if I want to do like a third Marsh Rosemary, a third Yarrow, and a third Meadowsweet, I'll take the recommended quantities for those, divide them into a third, and add that amount as a starting point. And then, try it, see how I like it, try and adjust the tastes, the flavors based on that. And you can adjust both the quantities and the amount of time on the heat. So yeah, it really is a lot of experimentation. Take good notes. I don't always remember to take good notes. I swear I'll remember and I never do. So take good notes. That way, if something goes right, you'll know what you did right. If something goes wrong, you'll hopefully be able to figure out how to make it better next time. And then another recommendation is have multiple people help taste test the herbs because they do taste different to different people. The Horehound was the notorious one. But others will do that to lesser effect. And then if you're trying to brew a particular style of beer, it can be helpful to look at what hops go in and the timings for that so that what flavor profiles you get from those hops, and then try and match them back to the Gruit herbs to give you a starting point for which herbs you might want to use to achieve a similar flavor. And then, of course, the cautions. Almost all of these have cautions associated with their use. So please, if you're making beer with this, label and make sure that you pass along those warnings accordingly to the people who will be drinking your beer. And then it's noted that hops are a depressant relaxant, which some have suggested as part of the reason why hops were adopted into beer. But on the contrary, most of the Gruit herbs have an opposite effect, making the beer more intoxicating. So you'll probably want to drink less of it. So if you're going for quantity, not quality, maybe try a hopped beer first. Basically, just drink responsibly. And then here is a very short list of places that I have managed to source Gruit herbs. I am sure there are many, many more. out there. And again, if you know somebody who's got it growing, that's honestly the best place to source it. But those are, at least if you, like me, don't really have anything local, there's some places you can get it on the internet. And I've got a list of books with some notes as to which ones, what kind of information they've got in them. So if you're looking for a particular type of information, you'll know which books to get. And then I've got some websites that I found that have been helpful related to like the history of Gruit and some of the other people who've been experimenting with it. And then shameless plug for my own blog. I've got an article up. I posted the link in the beginning for that basically the content of this class, but in blog format. So if you need to refer back to it. And I think that's it. Yep, that's it. So what questions do you have that I haven't already answered?
I had a quick question on the Berliner Weisse.
Sure.
I was under the impression that was like an open lambic fermentation that gave it the alternate flavor. What herbs are used in it?
I honestly don't remember. I know that open fermentation is part of what gives it its characteristic flavor. But if I recall correctly, they don't usually use hops and they do use something else. I don't remember what. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. Thank you. Good to know.
A while ago.
I was wondering how you aged Gruit beers. Do you basically condition in the same way you would a hop beer, or do you age them a different amount of time, or you drink them fresher, or what's kind of a general rule about that?
Yeah, so I'll say that I'm still experimenting with some of that. So pretty much all of the Gruit beers that I have brewed have gone sour, like tart sour, fairly quickly.
Okay.
So like if you follow the normal timelines for a hopped beer, as far as I'm aware of them, where it takes about a month to do all the fermentation and then you bottle condition them for a couple of weeks,
Yeah.
you're going to end up with something that is going sour. If you bottle it sooner, at about 3 weeks, you usually miss the sour point. Although again, the longer it stays in a bottle, it will go sour. So that is the downside of Gruit, or the upside. I mean, I like sour beer personally, so I don't see a downside here. But I know if you're trying to brew, there are certain beers that really don't do great as a sour. The dark chocolate mint was one of them. It did not do good as a sour.
No.
I imagine it would have been really good otherwise. So like if you're trying for something that should not be a sour, you're gonna wanna bottle condition. So I do bottle conditioning. I can't speak to kegging, but you're gonna want to do it pretty young, and you're gonna want to drink it pretty fast.
Okay,
Because
that makes a lot of sense. I was also wondering about not boiling the wort, because I thought boiling the wort tended to sanitize it a little bit as well, kill
I
off
was
the.
interested in that as well, because my local
yes.
shop had like scared me so much about like sanitization.
Yeah, so generally, sanitizing things for brewing is definitely the best practice. There are ways to do it that don't require you to boil the wort. But yes, it is a way to sanitize. So you can do it. It's just that in period, they didn't always, because they didn't have to. They were also, I'm assuming, slightly less concerned with sanitization than we are. And they would drink their beers even younger than we do. Honestly,
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
there are recipes for ones that like you drink after 3 days, which is okay. Seems more like a soda than a beer at that point, but
Yeah.
And they also didn't carbonate necessarily, so we like our beers carbonated, so it takes that extra amount of time to either bottle condition them or keg them or whatever. But they didn't do that. They drank them, so they would drink them younger. Also, from what I remember, because I've had issues with sanitization in the past. I got a lambic strain in and could not kill it for the life of me. That was the other reason why mine were going sour super fast. I finally got rid of that. They're still going sour, it just takes longer. But I learned a lot about sanitization and the stuff that can spoil beers. And for the most part, the general advice is if it smells like beer and like you take a small little taste and it still tastes like beer, it's fine. Because the stuff that's going to cause you problems will make it either not, it'll smell horrible and it'll taste really bad. Like you're not going to want to drink it. So you'll know if it's the bad spoilage versus just the weird spoilage that's still safe to drink.
I have a friend in Ontario who does brew sours from time to time, and he basically says he has 2 complete sets of brewing hardware, one of which the sour yeasts and bacteria never touch, so that you can brew modern beer with that, and the wild stuff he uses the completely separate brewing line. So
yeah, like ideally you'd have a completely separate house for that, honestly. Like that's what happened with mine. Is apparently the first place I lived when I was brewing, somebody previous had gotten a lambic strain into the house, and it just got from the air into my stuff, and then it got in all of my stuff. So yeah, it can get in from the air. So yeah. And again, I really like the lambics. Like they were really good. I just wanted to be able to brew stuff that wasn't a lambic. But it still goes sour eventually. It's just a different kind of sour.
Cool. There's a comment in chat that says, "Thank you for an excellent informative talk." And I agree. Thanks. This was great. I really enjoyed it.
I'm glad. Hopefully people are going to be brewing more with Gruit. And if you're in my part of the world, I'd love to taste it.
It's less of a mystery now. I have always heard about Gruit, but very few people have actually come up with practical suggestions. And so I think your guidelines actually really give me a pretty good start as to where to start experimenting. So that's a first.
You have until Great Western War to work it out, I guess, because we do have the big contest the other end of the year.
September.
So we've got what, 7 months? Middle of October.
I know.
Yeah, and you've got plenty of time to experiment.
Yeah, with Gruits, it could. I don't have to age them.
10 batches easy between now and then.
You have to come up here and help me drink it, Selene.
Twisting my arm. This is the twisting my arm part. I have to come up and visit anyway. Okay, shall I conclude the recording and let us all go about the day's business?
Sure. Thank you.